Yeah, you have this quiz. How woo are you? Right. And so you've taken the quiz. You wrote the quiz, or
I wrote the quiz. Yeah.
okay.
I
All
was
right.
it was in the process of, doing what I just did, which is cobbling together all of the main tenets of the New Age movement, which is not easy to do, by the way, because it's kind of all, there are no gatekeepers. It's kind of
Right.
all over the place. There is no Council of Nicaea or
Mm.
anybody who sits down and says, this is New Age, this is not New Age. But yeah, I thought it would be useful for me and others who are reading along, or in this case listening along, to sort of place themselves on the what I call the woo meter. Goes
Mm.
all the way up from 0 to 20 because there are 20 questions in this little quiz. And I guess the only caveat, I call it the New Age assessment quiz. The only caveat is that when I have this posted online, some people say, well, does it mean that all of these things are not true?
Mm.
Woo does not mean not true.
Right.
Woo just means maybe, again, just sort of outside the bounds of what is believed in mainstream thought, or what you might get taught, say, in school. There may be a time in history when these things are not in any sense woo, but currently that's where we're at. So just check all that apply, or hold up a finger. If there's 20 questions, you'll have to obviously remember that you've gone through 10 if you've gone through all 10 fingers. And again, this is sort of a review of what I was just talking about. I believe that science and religion are compatible. I like Jesus, but Christianity, not so much. I've taken psychedelics, or would like to. I believe that everything is connected. Number 5, I'm spiritual, but not religious. I practice yoga and or meditation. I believe in angels and or spirit guides. I believe in channeling. I believe that ETs have visited Earth. Well, now we have apparently governmental confirmation of that. I talk about chakras and energy. I've had a tarot or astrology reading. I believe in reincarnation. I believe in Atlantis or Lemuria. I believe in a higher self. I create my own reality. I believe in the law of attraction. Very similar, actually. I'm a big fan of alternative medicine. I anticipate an evolutionary upgrade. I know my Enneagram type. And I've been to Burning Man. I want to go.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, author Darrin Drda joins me to discuss his book, New Age Wasteland, an inside look at the dark side of woo spirituality and culture. In an extensive conversation, Darrin discusses conspirituality, the woo to Q pipeline and the dangers of toxic ideas, cults and enlightenment as a tool for manipulation, the necessity of compassion with awakening, and what the New Age movement gets right. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated.
Darrin Drda is an artist and author of several books, including The Four Global Truths, Overcoming Empire, and his latest book, New Age Wasteland, which explores the dark side of New Age spirituality and culture. Darrin holds a master's in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco and currently lives in Santa Cruz, where he illustrates children's books and occasionally creates his own. Darrin, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. And as I told you before I hit record, you have the distinct honor of being my 100th guest. This is going to be the 100th episode, and I think it's really appropriate. And so I'm very happy that it's you.
Thank you, and congratulations. That's no mean feat. It's a lot of production and a lot of work that goes into every single episode, as you know.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I heard another podcaster once comment that the first 100 episodes is just practice. And so that's the approach I've been taking, is I'm just practicing. And now that I've hit 100 episodes, I'm going to extend it. The first 200 are practice.
Everything's practice, man. It's all practice.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
There's no destination.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I was really interested to speak with you about your book, New Age Wasteland. We both went to the same school, the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I believe that this served as a sort of the background or a prompt for you writing this book. And it's something that has been I've been thinking about a lot, because it was during the pandemic. There was a listserv that we were both on that kind of exploded. And I have felt that it was my fault in some ways, because I never really participated in the listserv at all. I was always kind of in the background. I think maybe once a year I would send out an announcement about a community college hiring fair or something. But there was one day in particular, and it started for me. I had a friend that I used to work with in high school, and we're friends on Facebook. And she would sometimes come across things on Facebook that she would kind of be like, I don't know if this is true or not. I'm gonna ask Nick. So she had sent me a link to a video called Plandemic. And she asked me, she's like, is this legit? So I spent several hours researching this, what was it, like 22-minute or something like this video, and entirely debunking it, looking at the credibility of the folks involved and taking a very close critical examination of it. And then at the end of the day, a message comes across this listserv that you and I were both on, talking about Plandemic. And since I had spent the whole day debunking it, I actually responded. One of the only times I ever did that. And then the listserv exploded. And things got so contentious that the listserv got shut down. So I feel like I broke it, but I thought that since this is something that we have in common, and I think if I remember right, you may have even shot me a very quick message at the time of support. But why don't we start with Plandemic and then kind of go into its connections, or how it is connected to New Age thought?
Yeah, it's a great starting point because it's sort of ground zero, not only on our particular listserv, but in terms of what people have been calling the conspirituality movement. The creator, Mickey Willis, is a bona fide conspiritualist, and that's actually a big thread that runs through my book, and it's, in a way, it was a big motivating factor for writing it. I had long thought about writing a book about the New Age, because having been soaking in it for so many years, I saw all of its places where it was not living up to its own ideals, and where there were contradictions, and where there were blind spots, and all these things that I kept noticing. There are many critiques of the New Age out there, and I had my own. So with that in the background, and of course, as you mentioned, we were both CIS students, and in my book and to friends, I joke about how CIS is the Hogwarts of the New Age. It's sort of the central gathering point for people of this like mind. And what's interesting is that it draws in this combination that you'll see to varying degrees throughout the New Age, which is this kind of combination of open-mindedness, curiosity, combined with a certain amount of scholastic rigor, academic rigor, and I dare say critical thinking, at least in some cases. And what emerged during this whole Plandemic debacle was a sort of rift between, maybe it's putting it too directly, but a rift between the critical thinkers and those who were not so much, or at least that was not a top priority of theirs. And so, yeah, we had this massive rift, and it occurred at large throughout the community, not just in our little clique, but in the CIS clique, but in the New Age community in general. So that was a starting point for me to say, well, there's something to that, and what it is. And in fact, I could say this is probably the primary motivation for me in writing the book, is that there are certain New Age ideas that I just don't jive with or don't agree with, but then there are some that are just flat out dangerous and toxic. And Plandemic sort of falls into that category. And lately I've been calling it the woo to Q pipeline, because it's sort of like, if you start, there are certain New Age ideas that might be just on the fringe of New Age orthodoxy, which we can get into. But from that fringe, one is likely, if you are not heavily invested in critical thinking, and if you're not discerning, you might make a slide into conspiracy thinking. And maybe it starts with a bit of disinformation, like pandemic, and then it goes into conspiracy thinking. And as many listeners will know, conspiracy theories very often have an unsavory element that is usually anti-Semitic or in some way bigoted in some way. And then from there, you may be finding yourself invading the Capitol. I mean, you're doing dangerous things. You're beating people to death with a flagpole. So there is, at the very least, you may be adopting some far right ideas. So conspirituality, as most people see it and define it, is this kind of Wu to Q pipeline where at the end you go from what is at least theoretically a sort of liberal, left-leaning ideology, the New Age, or at least it has its roots in that. We can get into that. There's a background of liberal thinking, and then you make this slide into far-right politics. And there are lots of ways that can happen, but it is absolutely a thing. For those listeners who are seeming incredulous at this point, it is having done the research, and now I'm spending a lot of time on TikTok, so I'm seeing, getting exposed to a lot of stuff, and a lot of it is really quite dark. So at any rate, Plandemic, the creator, Mickey Willis, he, as I said, is a spiritualist. He started out in the New Age, made I think the name of his production company is something like Awaken. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but it's something along those lines. It has a very New Age ring to it. He created this 30-minute film, as you said, that it's just full of disinformation. And it itself was quite dangerous in that it was obviously sort of promoting conspiracy thinking and essentially encouraging people not to get the vaccine, that it's a big plot and, the people in power are out to control everybody, et cetera, all the usual conspiracy stuff. But then Mickey Willis went on shortly thereafter to be one of the people on J6. He was at the Capitol. There is a famous clip of him where he's actually among the throng of people who are shouting, "Hang Mike Pence." He later, chanting this, and while they're trying to sort of break into the building, and he's there. You can see him very clearly. He later denied. He actually spoke that day as well on the same stage as Roger Stone and a few other people, also conspiritualists and anti-vaxxers and so forth. And he was on that stage, and then I can't remember if it was before or after, but he was at both events. And he later denied that they were saying that he said in one of his tweets that he thought they were saying, "Hey, Mike Pence," as though it were some kind of friendly greeting, never mind the gallows outside. And then he, went on to make other ridiculous claims that it was Antifa and that it was, it was a peaceful protest and all sort of the usual right-wing talking points. So he's full on into it. He then went on to make another Plandemic 2, Indoctrination, I think is what he called it. And then, yeah, he's still doing that kind of far-right legwork. So that's, again, one of my motivations for writing the book, is that it went from like, oh, there's a lot of things in the white, there's a lot of privilege, and there's a lot of, cultural appropriation and the usual criticisms that are leveled at the New Age. But then I became much more aware of how there's actually this very dangerous element. And I think the sad part that I'm learning more and more from my exposure to TikTok, which is primarily younger people, is that they're trying to get them when they're young. People who don't have the same kind of exposure to New Age ideas and the context of where those ideas came from. And they're sort of taking most of what they see, as far as I can tell, they're taking it at face value. When somebody says, I'm channeling an ET, they just assume that is the person is telling the truth. They don't, or that let's just say they're espousing, like there's a guy named Bashar who people might have heard of, who is really into this ancient aliens conspiracy theory stuff. And so he, people, when they encounter that, they'd assume that they don't know the backstory. They don't know where he got those ideas. I mean, essentially, he's just regurgitating ideas that came from David Icke and Zachariah Sitchin and Eric von Daniken and others before him. It goes back quite a way. So without that kind of understanding of where these ideas came from, I think it's easier for younger people to digest that material and just, again, kind of accept it at face value. And a lot of them are coming out of, I assume, the like more religious communities or evangelical communities. And so there is already this predisposition, I believe, to believing fabulous stories about talking animals and, virgin births and so on. So I think there's already this, it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of words, but yeah, it's a good place to start. And pandemic was a real sort of bombshell, and people scattered in different directions after being exposed to it.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I was not aware of Pandemic 2, and I kind of want to see it, but I kind of don't. One of the classes I teach is critical thinking, and I'm supposed to address pseudoscience. And so I've thrown conspiracy theory in there as well, and I use Pandemic. And I have it's a conspiracy theory handbook, which shows or discusses the detail, how to identify a conspiracy theory. And Pandemic hits almost every single one of the points. So I feel it's important that I have students kind of watch it and analyze it, because often, like you said, people will see this, but they don't have those tools. They don't have the analytical tools to spot what is false and what is conspiratorial. And
and with that one, sorry to interrupt. And with that one, I just wanted to say in particular, Mickey Willis, you have to hand it to him. He did it. It was a very skillful production.
Yeah.
Very slick, very beautifully shot and edited. The background music was there to sort of draw you into the drama. It was very emotionally manipulative in all of those ways. And it was a very successful film. It was not, I think that was part of why it was so successful, was that it really had this veneer of credibility, and it really seemed like something that somebody with a lot of money or authority would produce, rather than it wasn't a sort of YouTuber in their parents' basement situation. It was a slick production.
Yeah, it was very slick. And it boggled my mind that so many people in the New Age community kind of fell for it. And speaking of January 6th, one of the primary images that we have of that is the QAnon shaman. And this is not something I expected at all. And so, again, this is one of the main reasons why I really wanted to speak with you about your book. And it is a very good book. It goes into a lot of detail. So, speaking of detail, why don't we step back for a few moments and discuss what the New Age
shaman,
is.
by the way, sorry about that. Just to put a pin on it, he is sort of, I consider him to be the sort of poster boy for conspirituality. For those that don't know what conspirituality is, just point at that guy and say, that's what's up. A far right guy who is steeped in all of this star seed, shamanic. I've taken mushrooms. I'm a shaman kind of, but yet I'm aligned with these far right politics.
Yeah. Well, I think that before we get into the details of the New Age, I think that sometimes I see, we tend to think in terms of political ideology as existing on a line, as a kind of spectrum, but sometimes it's very circular, and it's really difficult to spot when you're going from left to right sometimes. I know I had to do that when in my salad days, after reading a lot of Noam Chomsky, I was all about anarchism. And then I started hearing a lot of the libertarians, and especially a lot of the far right libertarians, talking about, like, who is it? Grover Norquist, drown the government in the bathtub.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, wait a minute.
Burning Man.
Yeah. I'm like, well, wait a minute. This sounds a lot like what I was. No, I can't. No, I think government does serve a purpose. And I'm glad I caught myself, but I could definitely see how easy it is if you have that model of it being kind of circular rather than linear, that you can fall prey to some really questionable ideologies.
Yeah. Libertarianism is an excellent example, because it's an admixture of certain traditionally left ideas and some traditionally right conservative ideas, but it tends, at the end of the day, it tends very heavily towards the right side of the spectrum, at least where things matter, or where it's causing the most harm.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get into the New Age. So for anyone who is unfamiliar, what is the New Age movement? Easy question.
$1 million question. Yeah, there are a lot of ways to approach it. I was trying to think of this morning as I was making my coffee, just sort of what is the elevator pitch sort of thing. And the simplest, most succinct definition I can think of is alternative spirituality. And that is alternative, meaning obviously alternative to traditional religion. So one of the main defining factors of the movement is that it is a reaction to and an approach to organized religion that says we reject all the trappings of organized religion. We reject all of the ideology and the dogma, and instead we are going to sift through those belief systems and pick and choose what it is that is beneficial to us. So there is this mentality of kind of a spiritual shopping mall, for which it is also criticized because it very often leaves out certain elements of given religions that are actually quite important. Like, for example, it might leave out entirely the ethical component of something, of a given system, and just adopts the practices, believing that, sort of the main goal is to experience 5D consciousness or enlightenment or whatever. So that gets into another big talking point of the movement, is that it's very much focused on mysticism, or a direct experience of the divine. In fact, one of the major defining characteristics of the movement is the spiritual but not religious thing. So again, it relates to the first point, but it's the idea of sort of rejecting the trappings of religion while embracing the non-dogmatic spiritual parts of those traditions. There is a big component that is invested, especially nowadays, with yoga and wellness. That is a very big overlap of the Venn diagram, almost to the extent where that one could say that they're almost the same thing. There is an emphasis on alternative healing. So there's a history to all of these trends that we can also talk about, but that goes primarily back to the New Thought movement of the early 1830s and 1840s and beyond, where there was a guy named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby who basically believed that all illness was caused by some kind of psychological disturbance. So there is a thread that comes through, and of course that also these days morphs into another big component of New Age, which is the whole law of attraction, manifestation stuff. New Thought was essentially, to boil it down, was really about mind over matter. So if you believe that you quote unquote create your own reality, or that at least you have significant influence on your reality in the way that an occult magician would, then you are probably in the New Age. There is also a belief in extraterrestrials. That is actually something that before starting research on this book, that I myself hadn't really delved into that deeply. I mean, I've always been kind of interested, curious about UFOs and all that, but I guess I learned more than I became more aware of how integral that is to at least the modern New Age movement. But it does go all the way back to the originator of the movement, who I trace all the way back to a guy named Emanuel Swedenborg, who was writing in the 1760s and 70s, before that, even 50s and 60s. And so we're talking over 250 years ago. One of the things that he was a Christian mystic, but he visited other planets and he talked to people on Venus and so forth. So there's this extraterrestrial from the get-go. And of course that became more prevalent during the middle of the 20th century, when we were actually engaged in a space race with the Russians, and outer space was really, kind of a major theme. And these days that particular strand manifests as star seeds, people who believe they've actually come from another planet and have been sent to Earth to, help wake people up and help them escape the matrix and all this kind of stuff. There's a strong belief in the New Age about reincarnation that comes a lot from its reliance on Eastern religion. And I guess I would sort of put myself in that camp, because I'm coming primarily from a Buddhist perspective. If I had to identify religiously, philosophically, I would say Buddhism is sort of my jam, or at least my background. And that Eastern influence comes largely through Blavatsky, although it comes from other places as well. There were all the transcendentalists were in America were into Eastern religion. Astrology, of course, as you know, is a big important part of the New Age movement. Kind of related to that. There is a belief in channeling. That's pretty central. A lot of the core works of the New Age movement, like A Course in Miracles, for example, these are all channeled texts downloaded from some higher source. And that goes back to the spiritualism movement, which is again in the same time roughly as New Thought, 1830s, 1840s. People started doing seances and believing, in their living rooms and believing they were contacting dead relatives and so forth. And actually the spiritualist movement, which really was big during the Civil War, and because people wanted to contact their fallen family members, people who had died in the war, and actually very popular after World War I as well. And then it sort of petered out, but it still filters through the New Age spirit, spiritualism and basically divine beings, angels, spirit guides, higher self, all of these kind of entities that are perceived to be outside of oneself and that can guide us. It's in Blavatsky's work as well, the ascended masters. So there are, in the New Age movement, there's a very strong belief that there are other forces, other beings who are sort of helping this enterprise of human evolution. And that brings us to the main thing, which the New Age is all about, which is right in the name, the New Age. It is right. There is a very strong belief that we are entering into some period of human evolution, of unity and peace and all the good things, the sort of heaven on earth that everyone has always dreamed about. And that's core, that's central. I mean, if you approach it from the astrological perspective, then we're talking about the age of Aquarius, which, as some people probably know, there are astrological ages that have to do with precession of the equinoxes. It's somewhat complicated, but in any way, we are on the cusp of, or moving into, or already arrived into this new age, which is said to be characterized by a kind of more democratic, egalitarian, grassroots approach to everything, to human organization and civilization, rather than the previous age, which was the age of Pisces, because precession, you're moving backwards through the zodiac. So in the age of Pisces, astrologers believe that it was a time of rulers and authoritarianism and kings and queens and princesses, and basically a sort of top-down governance and people from outside of one's source telling you what to do and telling you what to believe, essentially. And in theory, New Agers believe that we are moving out of that into a more egalitarian. But what I'm finding, what I have found in being in the New Age and being immersed in these ideas is that, unfortunately, we're carrying over so many of the authoritarian tendencies. I call it spiritual authoritarianism. And to me, it is the idea that you're getting your spiritual truths from something external, generally something quote unquote higher. And so, for example, channeling, I believe that's totally spiritual authoritarianism. Whether or not it's happening, whether it's actually true, no doubt some listeners will say, I'm a channeler, I know people who do channel. The point is that, at least in my mind, if we are going to believe the age of Aquarius, or if we're going to even think about it as some kind of meaningful abstraction even, why not sort of de-emphasize things like channeling, which is, again, telling us that spiritual authority is outside of ourselves, that it's somewhere out there. And in any case, it's just a faith claim anyway. It can't be verified. It's exactly like saying, that making any kind of metaphysical claim, when somebody says, I'm channeling something, you have to trust them. There's no way to actually verify it. I mean, apparently, like people with Bashar, they have done brain scans on him, and when he's, by the way, claims to channel an extraterrestrial named Bashar. Darryl Anka, he's a Hollywood guy, actually a special effects artist, and he's really into science fiction. Worked on a lot of science fiction films. But apparently, in his brain scan, they found a lot of activity in certain parts of the brain that are not normally active. And to me, that's like, well, yeah, obviously people can go into altered states in various ways. Certainly doesn't prove that he's channeling it. So in any case, it's kind of a faith claim. And I personally am hugely allergic to faith claims. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons why I left organized religion, I grew up as a Christian, Catholic to be specific. And, I deconstructed and got out of that whole thing when I was in high school. So it pains me to see similar things happening in the New Age, because one of the reasons that I found refuge and found nourishment in the New Age is that it sidestepped a lot of those things. So that brings me into one last thing that I might want to touch upon in this long-winded answer, which is that the New Age is very much always attempted to synthesize science and religion, or science and spirituality. And that goes, again, all the way back to Swedenborg. That was one of his main claims, is that science and religion are compatible. And looking at the history of the New Age, what you will see, and even modern New Age, you will see that that is a very rocky relationship. It's a beautiful claim. It sounds good. We all want it to be true. Those of us who are both spiritual and scientifically minded, we desperately want that to be true. But there are so many instances in the history of the New Age and the current New Age where there is a direct conflict, and you pretty much have to choose, whether it's going to be, one example that I can give is Atlantis, right? This is a common belief that comes, the myth of Atlantis goes way back to Plato, and is picked up by different authors of the Middle Ages, and then within the New Age picked up by Blavatsky. And she was one of the people who made the claim that Atlantis was a real place, rather than an analogy or just a myth that has, most myths have a certain kind of moral to the story, right? In this case, the claim was that Plato's original story had to do with, getting too arrogant, too hubristic, and that, if you do that, your civilization will perish. Essentially, that was the message that he was trying to get across. But certain thinkers thought, no, Atlantis is a real place. And I bring up the example because obviously there's no archaeological proof of Atlantis, or certainly nothing definitive. There are some things, this suggests that, or this could be that, but you won't read about it in a history book. And you won't read about it in science class. Oh yes, there were the Atlanteans, and here's how they behaved. That is, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is not because it's a conspiracy. I mean, you can believe that if you want, but Occam's razor is going to say, no, it's because it's not true. But the reason I bring up that example is because people like Steiner, who again was a disciple of Blavatsky, he believed that the Akashic records were true. He was one of these people, by the way, who firmly believed that science and religion were compatible. But whenever something like that came up, like, well, actually, there's no evidence for it. Well, he would say, well, I saw it in the Akashic records. There was this conflict, and in each case, he would choose the spirituality. He would say, well, that information is only available through meditation. It's at some higher level, a different level of knowing than our consensus reality. What do you do with that? I'm not sure. It's just what I personally do is I say, well, sorry, we live together on this earth. We have to figure out a way to discern what is true. And we have something called science that really helps us do that. It is an imperfect system. It's not, it is, it has its holes and its shortcomings, but it's the best we got. It is by far the best we got. And if we want to, if you want to engage in flights of fancy or whatever, that is totally fine. But as soon as you, subjective flights of fancy, but as soon as you start saying that it's subjectively true, and furthermore, demeaning those who say, well, actually, it's not, there's no evidence for it. Oh, but I've received it from some higher, my source is higher than your source. As soon as we engage in that, I think we obviously have an epistemological impasse. So anyway, I thought about this, since we're on the subject of all of the beliefs of the New Age. I thought about perhaps administering my quiz, which is on page 5 of my book, called How Woo Are You? And we can do it quickly.
Yeah. Well, can I ask just real quickly, what is the connection? Where did the term woo come from? Because I first heard it about 20 years ago, I think, is the first time I heard woo. And it got associated, or was associated with, sort of New Age thought. So where did that come from?
I don't know the actual source, but woo woo, as it is sometimes called, I shorten it to woo in my book, is the shorthand version for the sound that is made in certain science fiction films, especially from the 40s and 50s, 60s, Lost in Space and so on, where
Right.
it's the sound of the theremin. It's the theremin that goes, the thing that you can control the pitch and the volume by the proximity of your hands. So that is the woo sound, right? But it has come to, through the magic of language, it has come to refer to anything that is outside the boundaries of established thought.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's what I was looking for, was that explanation. And I think sometimes with origins of things, they have a life of their own and you can't pinpoint them. But yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, you have this quiz. How woo are you? Right. And so you've taken the quiz. You wrote the quiz, or
I wrote the quiz. Yeah.
okay.
It was in the process of, doing what I had just did, which is cobbling together all of the main tenets of the New Age movement, which is not easy to do, by the way, because it's kind of there are no gatekeepers. It's kind of all over the place. There is no Council of Nicaea or anybody who sits down and says, this is New Age, this is not New Age, But yeah, I thought it would be useful for me and others who are reading along, or in this case, listening along, to sort of place themselves on what I call the woo meter. Goes all the way up from 0 to 20, because there are 20 questions in this little quiz. And I guess the only caveat, I call it the New Age assessment quiz. The only caveat is that when I have this posted online, some people say, well, does it mean that all of these things are not true? Woo does not mean not true. Right. Woo just means maybe, again, just sort of outside the bounds of what is believed in mainstream thought, or what you might get taught, say, in school. There may be a time in history when these things are not in any sense woo, but currently that's where we're at. So just check all that apply, or hold up a finger. If there's 20 questions, you'll have to obviously remember that you've gone through 10, if you've gone through all 10 fingers. And again, this is sort of a review of what I was just talking about. I believe that science and religion are compatible. I like Jesus, but Christianity, not so much. I've taken psychedelics, or would like to. I believe that everything is connected. Number 5, I'm spiritual but not religious. I practice yoga and or meditation. I believe in angels and or spirit guides. I believe in channeling. I believe that ETs have visited Earth. Well, now we have apparently governmental confirmation of that. I talk about chakras and energy. I've had a tarot or astrology reading. I believe in reincarnation. I believe in Atlantis or Lemuria. I believe in a higher self. I create my own reality. I believe in the law of attraction. Very similar, actually. I'm a big fan of alternative medicine. I anticipate an evolutionary upgrade. I know my Enneagram type. And I've been to Burning Man, or want to go. By that metric, Grover Norquist, who you mentioned earlier, would qualify, because he's been to Burning Man.
Yeah, for sure. So my score, I've taken the quiz before, and I scored lower this time than when I did before. When I think that partly that's because I had questions in the questions themselves.
Yes.
And so this time I scored 11, which according to your scale is I'm getting there. Before, I believe I scored 14, which was you're in the club. And depending on how the questions are intended, I could very well be in the top tier with Beam Me Up, Scotty.
But there's a lot of interpretation of what I encourage people to do is to not think about it too much.
Right.
Sort of give the gut, whatever comes first in your mind, just let that be the answer. Yeah, I should probably give the scale. So 0 to 4, better luck next time. 5 to 8, ask your metaphysician if the New Age is right for you. 9 to 12, you're getting there. 13 to 16, you're in the club. And 17 to 20, beam me up, Scotty. Right. You are very woo.
Yeah.
To be totally transparent, I scored a 14 as well, which I think is what you said you scored the first time.
Yeah.
So I'm in the club, sort of barely.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I'm in the club, I guess. But, one of the things that you noted in the book, and I wanted to ask you about, is that often people who are in the club are reluctant to identify that they are in the club.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the New Age is often, certainly by the mainstream or by scientific folks, it is ridiculed and castigated. One doesn't want to immediately put on a label like that. I mean, first of all, most people are just averse to labels in general and would rather avoid them if they could. But especially with the New Age, which again is sort of pretty widely ridiculed, at least in certain quarters. And these days you just don't even really see the term used very much. I mean, I think I consider sort of the height of the New Age movement to be like the 80s and probably into the 90s, and now we have, it's still going, but it's sort of tweaked and distorted in such a way that it's hard to call it the New Age, but it's the same set of ideas, so I think it's safe to do that. But yeah, I think it has to do with nobody wants to be the butt of the joke, if you're a New Age.
Well, I think there's value in some of the ideas, and some of them I just want to tweak a little bit to get the value. So, for example, the whole law of attraction and I create my own reality. Now, I don't believe that I create my own reality. I believe that I can affect my own reality. I think my thoughts play a huge part in the reality that I experience. But,
Absolutely.
if I could create my own reality, I could fly and shoot, lightning out of my fingertips. And I can't do that.
Yeah, right.
And the law of attraction, to some extent, I think, and it's like you had noted that they're very similar, is I do think that the thoughts that I have and the attitudes that I have go a long way in determining the reality that I experience. Right. So I think that there's positives in there, but
it can be hugely empowering when somebody first encounters that set of idea, if they're used, especially if they're used to feeling powerless.
Right.
Maybe they've been grown up in a religion or just a family or a set of circumstances that in which they feel they don't have much agency over their life. It can be hugely empowering to say, oh, actually, I do have agency. I at least influence my life. Now, I think the problem, as you so eloquently stated, is that there is truth in it, and the truth is that it gets dramatically overstated, which unfortunately is true for many New Age belief. There's a kernel of truth in all of the things, many of the things. Actually, some of it is just pure garbage, but some of it is, there's a lot of truth to it, but it's sort of like a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory always contains some grain of truth that is then warped or distorted to create a narrative that the initial point of reference does not reference. It doesn't take you there, but people want to go there. So with Create Your Own Reality, it's very similar. Obviously, as you said, we influence our reality, we shape our reality, we participate in our reality. We might even say metaphysically in some way that we co-create reality, all of us together.
Yeah.
But the New Age, one of its major criticisms, not just from me, but from lots of directions, that it's can be a very narcissistic enterprise. Really strong emphasis on self-actualization and self-improvement, which is, nothing wrong with that. But if it's at the expense of, other things, and especially if it's done with an ignorance or a not being aware of the immense privilege that goes into self-actualizing. There's so many people on the planet that are still on Maslow's, that on the bottom of the hierarchy is still looking for safety and security, shelter, food. So at any rate, there is validity to some of the ideas. You take it too far, then you get into extremes. I mean, on its far extreme, it's solipsism. It's the idea that I'm the only person in it. You're an illusion. This whole thing is an illusion. All of this is fake. I'm the only one who exists. I am, in a sense, God. Maybe I am God, and therefore I get to create whatever I want. I don't see how anybody who believes that wouldn't just immediately run up against the limitations that you noted. Like, no, I can't do anything that I want. I am bound by something called reality. And it's, even if it's an illusion, it's a damn stubborn, persistent illusion that we all have to contend with and that we share. And, there are also limitations that have to do with my cultural program, my upbringing, my sociological status, all kinds of things that are not factored into the law of attraction. So my biggest critique with it is that it's socially regressive. It can very much go in the Wu to Q pipeline, because
Yeah.
it basically ignores, or at least it denies, or at least ignores systemic problems and systemic inequality. It
Right.
assumes that all of us have the same capacity to reach our goals, for example, simply by thinking correctly. Worse yet, it tends to blame the victim. So if
Right.
you are creating all the wonderful things in your life, you are also, according to this ideology, you are creating all of the bad things in your life. You're creating all of the tragedies. You are, in some sense, bringing upon yourself abuse, trauma, rape, you name it. All of those things are forgiven in this.
Right.
They are, in fact, they're ignored at the extreme, which is, I think, or not even the extreme. Solipsism, as I said, is the extreme, but on the further end of the spectrum, there is no accounting for victimization of any kind.
Right.
And and again, there is some truth to that. We don't want to wallow in a victim consciousness for sure, but in this ideology, there is no such thing as a victim, and that's where I start seeing that it is not only politically regressive because it aligns with the ideology of the far right, but also it's just cruel, and
Yeah.
it's dehumanizing. I mean, you're going to tell a 5-year-old with bone cancer that they're just not thinking correctly,
Right.
and that essentially it's your fault, or you wanted this, you brought this upon yourself. Just this morning I got a message from somebody on one of my social media saying, yeah, it was in response to a video about the law of attraction, and I was saying that she's somebody who has a terminal illness, and she said she's always felt a lot of shame and guilt when she encounters this, because it essentially is telling her that she wanted this, she asked for this illness, and she can't, she feels bad that she can't pray herself out of it or manifest her way out of it, and just to be, go full circle on this, there are new age teachers, Esther Hicks and so on, who are really into the law of attraction, who have explicitly blamed the Jews for the Holocaust.
Right.
They have said, yeah, there was people push up against this obvious, moral shortcoming in this viewpoint. And they are if you believe that ideology, you're forced to admit, yes, the 5-year-old who has cancer, bone cancer, actually did bring that upon themselves. And that is, to me, just unspeakably cruel. And one last thing about that, which I just found out about recently, I didn't even know about this. One of the new age teachers who's really into law of attraction stuff, there's so many. In fact, if you're not doing law of attraction in the new age, or at least have something substantial to say about it, I would say you're not even in the club, right? Mm-hmm. So it's such a core thing, at least these days. There's a teacher named Dolores Cannon, and she is now deceased, but she had this idea. Apparently she's a hypnotherapist, so apparently she got all of her ideas from her patients, and people will claim, well, these are not her teachings, these are things that she advanced all of these ideas, so I call her a teacher. But at any rate, she had this idea that if you create your own reality, then that demands that in certain situations, like when you go to the store, there are extras. There are people who are not even real people. They are avatars, or they're holograms, or whatever. She called them backdrop people. So how dehumanizing is that? I mean, that is setting people up for fascism. That is setting people up for the extermination of entire groups of people. I mean, I'm sure she didn't intend it that way, but it is a toxic idea.
Right.
And most of this is about ideas. I try not to attack particular teachers and particular, people, but rather it's, I'm an ethical pragmatist in the way that William James was an ethical pragmatist in that tradition. The worth of something is any kind of claim like that you create in reality has both a truth factor, how truthy is it, and it also has an ethical factor, with what is the cash value of that belief, whether or not it's true. If you believe in it, what does it bring forth? What benefit does it add to the world? And this, to me, is something that has no cash value whatsoever. In fact, it's dangerously dehumanizing to believe that we're walking around in some reality, or maybe it's a simulation. That's the new idea in the new age. But either way, it entails people who are not real. And what is to prevent somebody from just thinking that certain people are expendable or exterminatable,
Right.
can be
Right.
genocided or whatever. So just to one final point, that to make that sort of put an exclamation point, punctuation point on the ethical pragmatism thing, the Buddhist traditions, for example, encourage you to view everyone that you meet, or even strangers, people you haven't met, as somebody who used to be your mother. Okay, and if your relationship with your mom is not so good, maybe think about somebody else who is very, very dear to you, a lover, a really dear friend, just somebody who every time you think about them, you're just filled with warmth and love. That relationship was present with every other being at some point, since we all lived countless lifetimes. Someone could say, well, okay, maybe that's not true. Fine, but it has immense ethical value to think that way, to condition your mind to think that way, and to approach every new relationship, or to see every stranger as someone who you once dearly loved. That to me is a way to cultivate compassion, because at the end of the day, that's to me what it's all about. Specifically, how, and I've made videos about this as well, but the cash value of any belief system, whether it's New Age or Buddhism or whatever, is how does it condition you or help you to treat others well. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. If it's helping you to be a more patient, kind, compassionate person, and specifically how you approach others, and even more specifically, how you approach people who are less fortunate than you and less powerful than you. This would certainly include, how do you deal with your waitress? You're in a position of power. How do you treat your waitress with kindness? How do you treat your children, or children in general? How do you treat animals? Politically, how do you treat people who are less fortunate than you? How do you treat marginalized groups?
Yeah.
How do you treat the LGBTQ plus community and trans people? This is important, because that's to me, that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where so many New Age teachings, at least in my estimation, fall completely short.
Yeah.
Regardless of their truth claims. Again, this is the point. Regardless of the veracity of some of these claims, believing in them, from my own experience, does not bring one closer to that kind of compassion that I'm talking about. Compassion towards those who are less fortunate.
Yeah. You had a quote that I noted from your book. You wrote that practicing yoga and meditation, preaching the gospel of wellness, or engaging with other New Age rituals and ideas does not automatically make one a virtuous person. And I think that's absolutely correct. And I have something I want to say to that end as well. But I wanted to note, I had Mitch Horowitz on the show quite a while back now, and he identifies as New Age, and he just welcomes the moniker, but he also recognizes that there are problems to the New Age. And one of those problems is, in the term doesn't quite work, but it's a theodicy, because it's what you were just saying, is that if we create our reality, there's all this victim blaming, and how do you answer this problem of suffering? And so when I had him on the show, that's what I was trying to get him to explore, and he did a great job with it. It was, what is let's critically examine some of these claims, because I see that is something that's missing often in the New Age movement, is people will accept these claims, but then there's not a lot of inquiry as to whether or not those claims ought to be accepted or not, whether or not they're true. Often it is, well, I like the sound of it, so I'm going to accept it. I create my reality and kind of go with it. And then you can kind of cherry pick the evidence to get, it's a confirmation bias, right? And so I think that, and we'll kind of end with some of the positives of New Age. And I think that can kind of play into it, that the claims have to be tested a little bit. If you want to have that merging of science and spirituality, you have to test it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I believe so. Yeah. And again, there is, to me, and it sounds like you're maybe agreeing, is that there is, along with the veracity of something, again, there is the, what is, if we adopt this belief,
Mhm.
where will it get us? Will it help us
Right.
solve some of these deeper problems of human existence? Of, like you said, where does evil come from? That is the vexing question that has been on the minds of human beings since the very beginning. Traditional religion does not do a very good job of answering that question, by the way.
Right.
If God is all knowing, why does he allow Satan, and why does he allow 5-year-olds to have bone cancer, and
Right.
children to be sexually violated, and all kinds of horrible things? Why is that happening? And there really is no good answer. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the sort of vexing part, is that the simplest explanation, or the simplest fact that we all have to come to terms with, is that bad stuff happens
Right.
for no reason that we can discern. I mean, of course we can make meaning out of it. We can always make meaning out of anything, and it's very healthy to do this. But we have to accept the impersonal cruelty, we might say, of the universe, that there are these horrible things happening to people who seemingly are quite undeserving. Now, that is exactly why. So the New Age belief in create your own reality, that is partly a response to the Odyssey. It's the New Age version of karma.
Right.
It's the traditional version of karma is something along, it's notoriously hard to define, but something along the lines of you reap what you sow. When in past, whatever action that you created in the past is having ripple effects on the present and the future. We're all living out karma that has been generated not only this lifetime, but in previous lifetimes. And it's a way of saying, again, you sort of get what you deserve. Somebody who is, agonizing or perplexed over why their child has gotten a terminal illness, it's supposed to provide some kind of comfort. Oh, in some past life they were a horrible person.
Yeah.
That doesn't really provide much solace to to the parents or to the child, to think that. But the New Age, you create your own reality, is very much along those lines. It's the idea that obviously, and again, there is some obvious truth to that. Whatever I'm doing now, whether it's a state of mind or an action, is going to have ripple effects. It's going to determine the next course of action in my life, like the movie Sliding Doors or whatever that is. You make a choice and you end up over here and sometimes it's a minor choice that ends up really having a major effect on your life. So I get, while, as far as I can tell, that's the New Age, that's their best shot.
Right.
At the Odyssey. It's their most valiant effort towards explaining. But again, like traditional religions, I'm afraid to say that it falls short. It in fact, it engages in, not only falls short, it's harmful, again, because of the blame the victim thing. And there is no way out of that situation, obviously, if you have a terminal illness or bone disease or whatever, and you're a small child, what do you do with that? So really, again, it just comes back to this idea of acceptance and coming to terms with the radical uncertainty of being alive. And at the end of the day, I think that's really what it's all about, is how gracefully can one sit with this radical unknowing and this radical sense of nobody knows what's going on.
Right.
And why any of this is happening.
Yeah. I think that's important. It's not some, we can't answer the why do the innocent suffer, but just acknowledge that they do. And what's important is the response to that.
I love that. Yeah, that's exactly it. We have the choice. That's what's within our power. Are we compassionate, and do we sit with all of that grief, and we sit with the parents and just let them have their feelings, or do we make up some story that is ultimately designed to make them feel better but makes them feel worse?
Right.
Which is, oh well, she asked for this.
Yeah.
Little Trisha, she asked for this disease in some previous lifetime, and so that doesn't help anybody. It just
no. And what I hear more and more now is this idea of soul contracts. And I find that to be pretty egregious too, that, before I incarnated, I decided that, well, yes, I will be a 5-year-old with leukemia, or, I will be a 12-year-old who's been raped by my father. And it seems like it doesn't answer the question, and it lets a lot of people off the hook.
Yeah,
Because
that's another big part of it, is that there's no sense of, if there are no victims, then there can be no perpetrators either.
right,
And if there are
right,
no perpetrators, there can be no justice.
right,
There can be, what is, if we based, let's just say, if we based society on those ideas,
mm,
we would have a very messed up society in which nobody
right,
was held accountable. You might believe in karma or divine justice or whatever, but in terms of our earthly existence, we obviously have to have laws and systems in place that make people accountable. So to me, it's toxic. It sounds like, again, like you're agreeing. It's toxic to believe that there are no victims, no perpetrators. There are people who do horrible things and should be held accountable, just as the victims deserve compassion, support,
mm,
and justice. That's part of what
yeah,
they deserve, is for their perpetrators to be held accountable.
right,
And yeah, it's a conundrum. I admit that, but it's also fairly easy resolved, I think, if you just approach it the way you just suggested, which is we get to respond.
right.
And in fact, our response is the important thing. It is what determines how good we are being a human being,
Yeah,
to put it
yeah,
bluntly.
yeah. Well, and I think that, it one is, it demonstrates this sort of lack of critical thinking, because like with the soul contracts, the way I've heard it expressed is that, your higher self says, oh, well, I need to have this experience. And it's like, well, but if the higher self acknowledges this, doesn't the higher self already know what, then why? And it's like, it's just woolly headed thinking. And to quote Buffy, woolly headed thinking leads to being eaten. But
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I do talk about it a little bit in my book, but what you're pointing to is that there are just some obvious logical inconsistencies as well. It really doesn't make
right,
sense when you start unraveling the philosophy behind it. It's
right,
philosophically untenable. It really
right,
doesn't make sense. I mean, even the idea that you brought up earlier, the soul contracts, if people in the New Age are very fond of saying things like, well, I chose the family that I was born
yeah,
into. And again, it makes sense. One can understand why one would want to have this agency, but then it also entails that your parents and everyone else in your family necessarily had to choose you. There was no option
mm,
for them to say, no thanks,
yeah,
not this time around. Nope, I don't want to be the father and mother of somebody with leukemia. No thanks. Whatever the choice is. So what you end up, if you follow it through to its logical conclusion, philosophically, you end up with predeterminism. You end up
yeah,
with everything is already, the script is already
right,
written,
right,
and we're just playing our parts, which is the exact opposite of what it sets out to do. It sets out to empower people in their lives and to emphasize and uphold the sanctity of free will and choice and personal responsibility. And all of that is great. There's nothing wrong with those values and those ideas. Obviously, again, there's truth to the fact that we are participating in our reality, and that we need to feel empowered in order to do that. And that can be immensely helpful to think that way. But again, if you tease out all the philosophy to its end, there are numerous contradictions that ultimately it falls apart.
yeah. Well, and I think that there is, and I think that this may be the connection, or a connection, between some of the New Age thought and even some of the woolly headed thinking and conspiracy, is this idea of the evolution of consciousness, and even ideas of awakening. Because the way I see people referring to awakening is, it's that they know, that they're claiming to have knowledge of something, and that everyone else, or these previous ideas, are false. And I can see where that would give them a sense of power, but yet just having knowledge isn't sufficient. And you've kind of mentioned this several times, without an ethic. And it seems to me that this is where, or one of the primary ways that the New Age is susceptible to that kind of conspiratorial thinking, because there's a knowledge without an ethic.
Yeah. Well, again, the contrast is Buddhism, which is, in most of the traditions, at least, there is the idea that the Buddhist path is wisdom and compassion. Right. So the wisdom is the knowing. It's sort of knowing how reality works at least in a general sense, or at least knowing how one's own mind works. And then the compassion is, at the end of the day, what is the wisdom? If the wisdom is supposed to be supporting compassion, they're supposed to be, they work together. And I don't see a lot of emphasis on compassion. Certainly there are a lot of New Agers who are very compassionate, no question. And there are certain ideas which can help foster that, but it's not a primary tenet. It's not something that shows up in all contexts. In fact, the opposite very often shows up, the cruelty. But that is definitely, as you mentioned, that is part of the conspiracy mindset, is that conspiracy theories there are lots of things, but one of the things that they are is a narrative that helps people feel, first of all, more in control of this radical uncertainty we were just talking about. It provides a story, a framework for, why are these bad things happening? Because of the bad people, X, Y, and Z, the New World Order, whatever. Right. People at the top, so it sort of makes something that's radically complex into something that's easily digestible. But another thing that it does is that it makes one feel special, as though they have secret knowledge. They have knowledge that nobody else has access to. And that points to me to what I call spiritual supremacy. There is a lot of that in the New Age movement, this idea that, I'm more evolved than you, I'm more awake than you, I'm more knowledgeable than you. It definitely shows up in the conspiracy world, but it shows up elsewhere as well. Yeah. And that leads me to think of a couple things. One of which is that I don't believe that there is any, I kind of said this at the beginning, that there's no destination. We're always, the New Age movement is very much focused, and has been at least since the 60s, although one could go all the way back to William James for this, actually, that self-improvement is the enterprise, And obviously that can become narcissism and solipsism, but one can fall into that trap. There's nothing wrong with self-improvement, of course, but if one obsesses about it, one can very easily fall into egotism and lots of things. And furthermore, one can just get caught in this endless cycle of, well, when is one sufficiently self-improved? When does that project ever, obviously it never ends, And I believe the same is true for the spiritual path in general. So I have a video on TikTok, which I've been using a lot lately to help promote the book and some of these ideas. But if there's any TikTok listeners out there, it's under New Age Wasteland. Please give me a follow and check out some of the videos. But one of them it's called Enlightenment is a Scam. And my belief in that regard is that enlightenment is, more often than not, I would say almost always, used as a tool to manipulate and control people. So first of all, somebody making the claim, let's assume, we would have to define what enlightenment means or whatever, but let's just say it's some kind of non-egoic state, some transcendence of the ego or whatever, which is it possible? Perhaps, I've not seen any evidence of it myself. The only person that I've met and been in contact with that has felt and seemed the most enlightened to me is the Dalai Lama. I spent some time in India and worked under him, saw him on a few occasions and met him on a few occasions. And, there was always this vibe and of just being very humble. And I think the humility is what really came across to me. So if you're making the enlightenment claim, isn't that first of all coming from some kind of ego place? Like, I am enlightened. I am, better than you. But more than that, it is placing somebody above accountability, essentially. So when you are making an enlightenment claim, which is true of almost every guru who has ever lived, and gurus, again, there's a whole big section in the book about cults. And so if you're a cult leader or a guru, you generally make this claim of being enlightened. And what that does is that first of all, again, it's non-verifiable. It's a faith claim. You have to either take it or leave it. But more than that, it places people above accountability, such that all of their behavior can then be construed as enlightened behavior. All of the abuse, and it almost invariably happens, sexual abuse with the students, grift, exploitation, it's all there, So in some cases, some gurus were talking about major crimes, drug trafficking, and, all kinds of things. But the guru can then always justify that behavior by saying that it's done from an enlightened state. I'm only sleeping with that student to further their spiritual growth. I'm only buying all of these luxury vehicles and these mansions to show that I am completely unattached to, it goes on and on. You can justify any horrific behavior by saying, so that's why I say enlightenment is a scam, whether or not it is actually achievable, then you can get into sort of the philosophy of the ego. And, many people say that we need the ego. We're not about transcending the ego, unless you mean transcend and include. We need the ego to not only to function in the world, but also to reach other people. If we have a message, to be a charismatic speaker, for example, some of the exemplars in that category are people like Martin Luther King Jr., who were very egoless people, at least by most standards, but also very charismatic. And, so we need the ego as something, as part of how we function, and it has absolute utility. So if you're talking about getting rid of the ego, that's a whole different thing. But in any case, when I hear somebody make the claim of being enlightened, or even sort of hinting at it, a lot of people like to playfully hint about it, not come out right out and say it, but just say, you'll see one day, this kind of thing. I have an impulse to run for the hills.
Yeah.
And, maybe that is part of, we haven't mentioned this yet, but I was part of my motivation for writing this book is I was in a cult when I was in my early 20s. That was quite some time ago. But the person that was the guru in this particular case, it was a new age cult, Kundalini yoga kind of thing. He never made those claims explicit. He was one of the people who kind of was a nod and a wink kind of thing. But in any case, whenever I see that, it is really a red flag.
Right. Yeah, I have used this quote a few times on the podcast, but I think it's appropriate here. And it's a line that Thoreau wrote in Walden, and it's, "I've never met a man who is quite awake. If I had, how could I have looked him in the face?" And I like that because it's a nice reminder that even though there are a lot of claims, there are way fewer people, if any at all, that have actually achieved it, achieved that awakening. And I'm glad that you brought up the section in your book on the cults. And maybe you can even, if you want, speak to your experience of it a little bit. But it was surprising to me because, typically, I never actually thought about cults as being part of the New Age. But you provide a very exhaustive list of New Age cults. And I was wondering if you could just say maybe a little bit more about the connection between these New Age cults, or the New Age and cults.
Yeah, I include a lot of New Age. I would say they're mostly new in the cult section. There are so many cults that, I could fill a whole book with just that. And other authors have done that. They've just encyclopedia of cults. I'm sure you could find many such books. So I tried to narrow it down to mostly New Age ones, but I also included a lot of Christian cults, which, by the way, the Christian cults are, for better or worse, they are, well, obviously for worse, they're the most destructive ones, at least on record, the ones who have the most casualties. So I have that section broken down into the degree of harm that cults cause. And so deadly cults, people have actually perished by being in this cult or participating in this cult. So obviously that includes, Jim Jones and Charles Manson and, Heaven's Gate and all of these ones that most of us have heard about, and some others that a lot of us that I hadn't heard about. And then there's the cults that are the abusive cults that have to do with generally abuse, psychological and sexual abuse, which is a huge category. And then there are the sort of questionable cults where they just have spreading a lot of ideas that I believe are toxic and that are, ultimately, harmful. And then there are the ones sort of like, I think I call them dubious. Like, is this a cult, or is this, realism, for example, this kind of a UFO cult would be one example of that. It doesn't seem to be harming anybody, but some of these ideas are just okay, take them for what you will. Again, what is the utility of believing in that a person is an extraterrestrial? I don't know. And then, so yeah, I was in a cult. It was not in the first category, although one could definitely argue that it was abusive. I myself kind of got off the hook fairly easily because it was a sex cult, and so just by virtue of me being a male, it was not as, I didn't have to be as vulnerable, I think, as the female members in the group, and some of whom were my friends, and they have, I think, they suffered more than I did in terms of the long-term damage. In fact, I write about this in the book, there were many aspects to being in that group that were actually beneficial. I didn't find the so-called physical work to be beneficial, but the guru was actually pretty well informed when it came to psychology and the history of religion in general. He'd obviously read many books about religion, and so he was knowledgeable. And being in my early 20s, and I was hungry for that kind of information, I found that beneficial. But ultimately, he used the same kind of tactics that all cults use, which have to do with, creating an in-group and an out-group, and trying to make one again feel special, that they're in the group, doing all of love bombing. That's a typical tactic of, we've been waiting for you for so long, you're part of this group, we were always meant to be part of this group, we're so excited you're here, which happens even in MLMs, which is another kind of called multi-level marketing groups, and all kinds of groups. But yeah, there was one other thing I was going to say about cults, and it just went out the window.
Well, that's okay. I wrote something down that I thought was really important that you noted in the book. And I think that you were quoting someone else, a cult expert, Kathleen Mann, but that's nobody joins a cult. People join groups that align with their beliefs and values and offer opportunities for growth, learning, inspiration, camaraderie, and mutual support.
Yeah,
And
I think that's an important thing to notice, to understand, that nobody joins a cult. Cults are not, they don't have a big sign on their front door that says,
right,
come join our cult. It's a process of indoctrination, and again, other dynamics of cutting off information from the outside world and so on. One is lured into the cult under false pretenses. So the best way that I have found to think about cults, because some people think, I've heard the opinion expressed, like only weak-minded people join cults, or only suckers join cults, or whatever. And unfortunately, that's not true. Again, you're lured in under false pretenses, and the best way to think about it, in order to have some measure of compassion for people who join cults, is that it's like an abusive relationship. So that's really the best way to think about it, is like a partnership, where one member, let's just assume statistically it's the man in a hetero relationship, is abusive. And it's not like he, on the first date, he's like, by the way, I'm abusive, I'm going to abuse you. That's not, that's not what happens. The person is lured in under false pretenses. I'm the nice guy, I can control my temper, all these other, all these other shows of his good side. And then when the bad stuff starts coming out, and the threats, and the you can't leave me or I'll kill you, and all these other things that are the same dynamics that happen in cults, when that starts happening, the person finds it very, very difficult to leave. So that's one of the, in fact, definitions of a cult, is that it's a very insular situation. Once you've cut yourself off from the outside world, which is again something that abusive partners do, you can't talk to your friends or your family, you can't call, there's this isolating element. So again, to think about in that way, I found it to be very useful.
yeah.
And again, to not fall into that trap of thinking that only idiots join cults.
Right. And it's not, and cults obviously aren't just New Age. There are a variety of cults. And it is interesting that a lot of the criticisms levied against New Age can be levied against other traditions as well. That, some things are unique to the New Age, of course, but some things are not. But, we're starting to run out of time here, and we've been critiquing the New Age. And I thought that maybe we can end with talking about some of the positives. What are some of the things that the New Age gets right?
Yeah, in the book, I sort of wait till the last chapter and I say, we've gone through all of this. We've waded through all of this, the cults and the conspiracy theories and the COVID disinformation and the conspirituality and all that. And, what's left. And I actually borrow 5 points from Mitch Horowitz, who you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
who I didn't know before talking to you that he identifies as a New Ager, because his book is called Occult America. It's very much about the occult, and he really actually doesn't even mention the phrase New Age until the very end. I mean, it's literally the last couple of pages, and he's basically saying that many of these cult ideas that have their origins in the U.S. Have been folded into the mainstream. They have been accepted as basically true. And so I go through these point by point, and the mind-body connection and other things that he talks about. And we could go through them point by point, but in this case, I just want to speak to what's most relevant to me, which is really the core, one of the core teachings or the core, maybe it's just an epistemological approach that the New Age embraces, which is that spirituality is a deeply personal affair. It is, the New Age idea that you are free to investigate and explore other avenues of spirituality that are not the religion into which you were born. That to me it's been hugely liberating to me, and I believe it's probably been hugely liberating to lots of other people who find themselves in the New Age milieu. That to me is one of the key takeaways. The other thing that I would note is that New Age, for the most part, embraces some of the core scientific ideas that have transpired since all of these axial age religions were established. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, all of those were founded in the sort of 500 years, 600 years before Christ, all at roughly the same time. I mean, when we look at the span of human history, we can say roughly. Islam was actually a little bit later, after the death of Christ and so on. But nevertheless, these traditions they were not aware at the time these holy books were written and the main avatars of these religions came forth. Nobody was aware of things like evolution or the Big Bang or how old the earth was, for example. So we have the traditional Christian idea or fundamentals of Christian idea that the earth is only 6,000 years old or whatever, and that it was created in sort of one fell swoop. We know that's not true. We know scientifically that there is no evidence for that, and there is scads, mountains of evidence for the contrary, that we live in a universe that's roughly 14.7 billion years old, and an Earth that's about 4.5 billion years old, and that the process of evolution began with simpler life forms and complexified, and human beings, evolved from alongside other primates, and et cetera. So that we know those facts, and for the most part, New Agers accept those as a reality, as a given, and that is huge. That's actually it's not insignificant. It makes a lot of difference. That you'll see a lot of what I call conspiracy theories about ancient aliens and so on, that actually what happened was that human beings were seeded with extraterrestrial DNA, and that's how we got the modern humans. And if that hadn't happened, everyone would look like Bigfoot right now. And these are straight up out of the book teachings. There's a lot of, again, this unhealthy relationship or this conflicting sibling rivalry, you might say, between science and religion. It comes up in all contexts, but for the most part, I can make a general statement, feel fairly confident that most New Agers believe in these basic scientific truths of the origin of the universe and evolution. Those are especially important because at least the Abrahamic religions, which is sort of the culture that we mostly find ourselves in, they have a cosmology that believes that essentially human beings were more or less placed into this container. The earth was made and the firmament and all that, and then we were placed here. This is a stage, right? And that ends up making a huge amount of difference, because the thing that leads to essentially a devaluing of the earth ultimately. I mean, you'll see in Genesis all about, God made man in his image and then gave him dominion over all the creatures. And so there's an idea prevalent throughout Christianity, and especially so in evangelicalism, the idea that the earth is ours to sort of lay waste to it if we want to. It's our, and here we find ourselves in the middle of an ecological crisis, existential crisis that has social ramifications, political, economic ramifications, all of that are basically tied to this essential reality that the earth system that we are living on is breaking down. And so that's causing the breakdown of other systems as well. So at the end of the day, that's, to me, one of the most important things to bear in mind as we move through the world, is that we are in the midst of this crisis. And part of what has brought us here is this kind of thinking of, like, the earth is here for us humans. It's only a way station. It's a proving ground, a moral battleground. One of my favorite thinkers, Joanna Macy, has a book called A World as Lover, World as Self, that talks very much about this, how our worldview, I mean, this is literally our view of the world, how that influences human behavior and the systems and institutions that we put in place. So again, it's not insignificant. It's to have a cosmology that embraces at least the core understandings of science, that the earth revolves around the sun, and basic things like this, which are not present again in these early holy books. It's hugely important, because again, that's where I'm coming from, is this having this deep concern for our ecological moment. In fact, my first book, The Four Global Truths, which you mentioned, is very much about the ecological crisis and how exactly what I'm talking about. That's, in fact, the premise of the book, is how these ideas mostly from these Abrahamic traditions, but elsewhere as well, have contributed to our ecological crisis.
Well, it seems like,
go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it seems like, one of the notes or points on the woo meter, I wouldn't consider it woo, and that's the idea that everything is interconnected. That's inherently ecological. And I also think that this idea of self-improvement is helpful to this extent, because the climate crisis that we're facing is a moral crisis in many ways, and we need to rise to the game. And one of the criticisms that I've had for a long time is the claim, and I kind of see it as coming out of New Age, or deeply connected to it, is if you want to change the world, change yourself. And I often would say, and I've changed it, my position on this, but I used to say, well, okay, but maybe if you want to change yourself, work to change the world. Because I saw that focus on the self could lead to what you had discussed earlier, this sort of solipsism or narcissism. But now I see it as both. Now I see it as both. And you write this, I think, towards the end of the book, and I just wanted to read this other quote, because I think you get it exactly right. And what you wrote was, I humbly suggest that we spiritual but not religious types can step off the wheel occasionally, if not permanently, to cast our gaze not upward or inward, but outward to the world around us. There we will find that which most needs our attention and care: our beloved family and friends, our communities, the greater human family, the extended earth community, and the planet itself, the precious and sacred foundation of life.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot I'd written that.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah, it's a core idea. I'm glad you brought this up. Maybe it's an excellent place to end and wrap it up, is this idea of interdependence. That's people in the New Age say everything's connected, but they also have there's so many varying interpretations of what that means.
Right.
And what I don't see is a way that core insight is really taken to heart. So I guess the most obvious example would be kind of what we're just talking about, is one's worldview. If you view the world as separate from you, that entails a certain kind of behavior. Your actions will play out in a particular way. But if you see the world as part of you, you are the world as lover, world as self. If your sense of interconnection runs that deep, then I think you will have a mature and well-informed spirituality, because it will break down that division that you are just talking about between inner work and outer work. How can there be any difference if we're all interconnected, and if all things are connected? My working on myself is the same as working on, and there's no priority that one, oh, make sure you work on yourself first, and then again, that point where yourself is sufficiently improved to then work on the world is never going to come. You will find yourself trapped on that treadmill that you just mentioned, the treadmill of self-improvement. Step off the treadmill and realize that you have everything that it takes right now to work on the world and be involved in the world. And this is probably a good time also to mention that there are lots of different ways to get involved in the world, outside of direct political activism that we're used to thinking about when we think about change the world. That has its place, but there are other ways to bring forward positive change and to be the change, and to elicit the change. Don't just be the change, but also help others become the change. Joanna Macy, again, has her wording for what we're going through. Her conception is called the Great Turning. And in the Great Turning, we are turning from an industrial growth society to a life-preserving society, a life-sustaining society. And in her conception, again, in her model, there are 3 different spheres that one could work within to help facilitate the Great Turning. And the first of which is exactly this kind of political activism. She calls them holding actions that are essentially the message to the world-destroying machinery, you might say, to just stop. This is the people who are out in the streets and protesting and tying themselves to trees and all of that. And there is obviously it serves an important role, if not just to buy us some time. Every time that another so-called development project or some dam or something is opposed and put off, we have that much more time to work on other tactics, and those include building new structures. So that would include different ways that we actually live in the world and the way we conduct business with each other. So that could include obviously changing our economic system. I would be in favor of that. I'm much more of a socialist than a capitalist, for sure. But then also it includes just things like farmers markets versus supermarkets, and permaculture versus monoculture, just different ways to approach what we're doing that are not as destructive and that may even be sustainable. And then finally, you have the third sphere, which is change of consciousness. So this is what we were just talking about, is that these ideas, this worldview into which most of us have been born, changing that to what people are just calling the new paradigm, or some people are calling the new earth, or whatever. Just as a side note, there is a belief going on right now, which is that within the New Age, that the earth is actually splitting in 2, and there is something called the new earth and the old earth. And some people actually, Bashar is one of the people who teaches it, that it's actually physically happening, not just energetically, but physically. There are 2 earths, and never mind the fact that we would all instantly be dead. But this is honestly so. But the reason I mention it is because it's a New Age idea, but it is so much caught up in the old way of thinking, old patriarchal religion. It's world denying. It's escapist. It's basically like, well, we messed up this world, so we're just going to pretend that we have another world to it.
Yeah.
And as many environmentalists say, there is no planet B. There is. This is it. So again, there's so many strands of this in the New Age. This kind of escapism, this kind of checking out, this ascension, and I'm very much into a grounded spirituality. That's essentially what I advocate, is a spirituality that is grounded in science, as we've been talking about, at least, which is not to say science becomes your new religion, but rather that it informs your beliefs, and that it is not a conspiracy, that it's an actual epistemological, way of understanding the world, again, the best we have. And so that would inform, it would inform even one's spiritual practices. There's a lot of scientific evidence that supports the beneficial nature of yoga and meditation, for example. So things that are grounded in practices that are grounded in this kind of scientific understanding, I would say go for it. If you're looking for, a practice or a belief system, let's at least start there. If you want to branch out into more woo over time, but if we have to all start with this foundation that includes this grounded spirituality and also grounded in the earth. As I said, the earth is we are earthlings. We are on a cellular level. We are some of our, components of our bodies come from the stars. Yes, but we were born in this cauldron. We evolved within this in concert with all the other beings on earth, and we are integrally part of the earth. We are not separable from it. And grounding one's spirituality in that, I mean, you could even say that the earth is our primary source of spiritual inspiration. It's where we get our sense of belonging. It's where we get our wonder and our sense of beauty. There's wonder and beauty in the stars, of course, as well, but most of it is here surrounding us, and the sooner that we fall in love with that and allow ourselves to be moved by the beauty that we see around us, the better we are going to be at protecting that. We protect that which we love,
Right.
Whether that is our family members or what have you, So that's at the end of my day, that's the suggestion is that we learn to fall in love with the world, and again, fall in love with each other as a community of earth beings. It's a challenge, but that's where we're at.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with you quite a bit. So I know that we are just about out of time here. So let me ask you, one, what are you working on next? What have you got coming up?
That's interesting. Yeah, hadn't thought about it. I was faced with the same question after I wrote my first book, and I was actually remember that this was the Four Global Truths, and this was the book that was actually published by a publisher, North Atlantic Books, and I was sitting in the office with the publisher, or at least publisher's assistant or somebody, and they asked me, they said, well, what's your next book about? And I hadn't considered it. And I said, well, it'll probably be similar. I keep revisiting very similar themes about basically we're in the middle of this crisis and what do we do about it? And what are some bad ideas that we could have? My second book was self-published that was called Overcoming Empire, a user's guide to personal and global revolution. So there was a lot in that, and there's a lot of Buddhism in there as well, but it's essentially a critique of capitalism and how it is inherently unsustainable and so on. But to answer your question, I don't know. I'm currently working on getting these kinds of messages out there through social media, basically promoting the book, but also just promoting the shift in consciousness, because that's where I feel most at home. I support permaculture. I live in community, and we have gardening and all of that, and it's beautiful, and I feel very fortunate about that. But in terms of where my nerdiness is best applied, it has to do with these big ideas and philosophy, and in this case, having to do with critiquing a movement that I've been part of for decades, which again has some great parts to it, and in other ways really falls short.
Yeah.
But anybody who's interested in the social media aspect, as I said, I'm doing a lot of stuff on TikTok these days, mostly because I like the interface. It has a really excellent editing tool. Like when you record a video, you can edit it on the fly and add music and special effects. It's really cool. And sort of got involved as just sort of like, let's see what this is all about. And I was like, oh, this is cool. But in terms of what I'm going to do for my next project or writing project, I'm not sure. If I had to guess, I would imagine it has a lot to do with deconstructing, because that's what I'm seeing as my new sort of spiritual enterprise. And what I mean by that is deconstructing from harmful ideas that have been taught to me through my culture. And so that obviously includes deconstructing from patriarchy and toxic masculinity and all the stuff that I've fed and am complicit in to some degree. And I want to get those things, those toxic ideas out of myself as much as possible. Maybe part of it is just coming to an acceptance of that, but it's also, I think one can do work on deconstructing from patriarchy, from capitalism, from racism, of course, and internalized racism and white supremacy, and all the stuff that we get fed. So in a sense, my focus is, you could say it's more political, but it's also, to me, it's a very deeply spiritual enterprise, because it entails a lot of humility and a lot of rough patches and a lot of encountering one's shadow and shame and all kinds of things that, to me, are spiritual traits, or at least it takes a certain amount of willingness to go through some very uncomfortable feelings, because one realizes when you're deconstructing not only how deep some of these beliefs go, but all the various ways in which, again, that you've been complicit and have helped participate. And certainly as a cis man, I have a lot to work on in that department of beliefs that I didn't even know that I had, or that and I can go back through various episodes of my life and just think, oh my goodness, that was some abysmal behavior, So it's that kind of investigation and really sort of pulling out at the roots. And one might say, if you're not interested in that, I would humbly suggest that therapy can do much of the same thing, and unfortunately, that's something that there's a lot of spiritual bypass in the New Age community, which is sort of jumping past the difficult things into the love and light and high vibes.
Right.
And again, as a grounded spirituality, I'm saying, let's not do that. At the very least, let's stay in therapy, do your ayahuasca or whatever, but also stay in therapy, like let's integrate these things.
Yeah. Integration is key. Integration is always key.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know that there are a lot of areas we could have gone, but time constraints keeps us limited. But I enjoyed the conversation, and I very much enjoyed the book. The book's available on Amazon. Is that correct? Okay. I'll put a link for it in the show notes in the video description. You're on TikTok. Is there any other social media that you're on that I can include in the video?
I'm on Facebook. I just haven't been using it that much lately, because I've almost made this complete transition.
Well, you're probably wise for that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I mean, the social media thing is such an interesting phenomenon.
Right.
Having to do with certain age groups are in this one, certain other age groups are in this one. I sort of skipped over Instagram and went right from Facebook to Facebook. But yeah, the book's available, both hardcover and new ebook, if you want to instant download. Either way is fine with me. One of them, some people really like the feeling of having a book in your hands, but I also understand the appeal, both environmentally and psychologically, of having one click and you're already reading the first page.
Yeah. Well, whatever the spirit moves that you to work on next, I look forward to it. And hopefully we can speak again at that point, or even sooner. But Darrin, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated it. And again, I appreciate your work and having the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, thank you so much. And congratulations on your 100th show again. And I appreciate the work that you do as well to bring these ideas to light. I know that you've had a lot of guests on here who we both might say are a little bit more into woo territory. So I appreciate you with the more critical, analytical, grounded conversation. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas. And people resonate with at least some of it.
Yeah. And it was important for me to do that. And maybe it's my training in academia, traditional academia, but credibility is important to me, and rightly or wrongly. And, I've had some guests where I'm like, but I've usually been able to maneuver the conversation in ways that I'm like, okay, I can be okay with this. But I think the ideas have to be explored one way or the other. And I think there's great value in being critical of them and asking these questions, as we've talked about. Is it true?
Yeah. Is it true? And is it helpful?
Yeah. Is it true? And is it helpful? Well, Darrin, until the next time, I will look forward to whatever you come up with next.
Thank you. And thanks again for doing what you're doing. Take care.
And that's a wrap on episode 100 of Rebel Spirit Radio. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has joined me on this journey to reach 100 episodes. I am so very grateful to everyone who has subscribed to Rebel Spirit Radio on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts, or who has subscribed to the YouTube channel, which recently reached 1,000 subscribers. And thank you to everyone who has left a review or shared the podcast on social media. I am deeply humbled. As I mentioned in this week's episode, I have been considering the first 100 episodes as practice, and that's how I'm going to view the next 100. My goal is to produce the best podcast I can and be the best host I can be. So again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And now, the usual. If you would like to support my work here on Rebel Spirit Radio, and please support my work, then sign up for my Patreon. Some of the perks for patrons include early access to videos, shout outs to members, a members only Facebook page, access to the Rebel Spirit Radio Discourse server, and a monthly book club where we explore books discussed on the podcast, spiritual and philosophical classics, and books related to the cocktail apocalypse. I mean, remember, I am a professor of philosophy and religious studies, so consider the book club an ongoing classroom where you can go as deep as you want with me and other Rebel Spirits. Patreon is also going to be starting free memberships in the next few weeks, so I'll be posting quite a bit of material on the site that is available to everyone. So please take a moment to sign up for my Patreon. You can find a link for the Patreon in the show notes or video descriptions. And of course, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can still do so via PayPal. I still have big plans for the podcast and the YouTube channel. Right now, this is all a labor of love, so your support will not only help me in continuing what I do here, but will also help me grow the channel and the podcast. I'm going to continue with the Cocktail Apocalypse live stream, and I plan to create at least one more this coming year. I'm also going to be creating more video content for the YouTube channel, and I'm also working on putting together a few classes. This is going to take a lot of time and work, so I will be tremendously grateful for any support that you can provide. Another way that you can help the podcast is to share it with friends, family members, coworkers, share it on social media. That really is one of the best ways you can help and support the podcast. Help me grow my audience. As I always like to say, I'm here in the Front Range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality and ecology, psychedelics and consciousness, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the Rebel Spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me share the good news. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. It only takes a second, and your 5-star ratings really do help, especially if you listen on Apple. If you have a minute to spare, please consider posting a short but positive review. And please subscribe. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be at peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.